I stood in the freezing rain, watching the gravediggers throw wet dirt over my father's casket. The mud seeped through my shoes, but the physical cold was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest. For 10 agonizing years, I was the only one who stayed by his bed. I wiped the blood from his lips, while my uncle, Silas, drank his way through our family fortune in European casinos. But yesterday, at the reading of the will, my uncle handed the lawyer a crumpled, handwritten piece of paper. According to that single page, I was completely disinherited, thrown out on the street with absolutely nothing. They looked at me and smiled, thinking they had buried my future along with my father. They were wrong. The graveyard was filled with vultures pretending to be mourners. The board of directors, the silent partners, they all wore custom Italian suits and held black umbrellas, keeping their distance from me. I stood there shivering in my charcoal suit, my clothes soaked, my eyes burning from weeks without sleep. Uncle Silas stood under a massive canopy, perfectly dry, his slicked-back silver hair catching the dull light. He didn't even look at the casket. He was too busy shaking hands, his heavy gold signet ring flashing as he accepted premature congratulations from the shareholders. And the family lawyer, Mr. Vance, a man who had eaten dinner at our table since I was 5, stood right beside him. The rain bounced off his round, wire-rimmed glasses as his grip tightened on his vintage brown leather briefcase. The briefcase that contained my execution order. 2 hours later, the air in my father's mahogany-paneled study was suffocating. It smelled of old leather and Silas's cheap, overpowering cologne. Mr. Vance sat behind the massive desk. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and read through the standard legal jargon, distributing minor trusts to the staff. And then, he stopped. Regarding the controlling shares of Blanc Industries and the primary estate, Vance's voice didn't even tremble. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a yellowed, folded piece of paper. A late addendum, handwritten and signed by Lord Elian 3 days before his passing, supersedes all previous documents. All assets, properties, and corporate holdings are to be transferred immediately to Silas Blanc. My heart stopped. The room started spinning. I slammed my hands onto the desk, rattling the antique inkwell. "That is a forgery," I screamed, the desperation clawing at my throat. "He couldn't even hold a pen last week." Silas slowly leaned forward, intertwining his manicured fingers. He gave me a look of such pure, venomous pity that it made my blood run cold. "Grief makes people delusional, Arthur," Silas whispered, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. He nodded to the 2 massive security guards standing by the door. "Mr. Vance, please ensure my nephew vacates my property in the next 20 minutes. If he resists, call the police." Just like that, 30 years of my life, my legacy, my home, erased by a single, fake signature. As the guards grabbed my arms, dragging me backward out into the storm, I looked back one last time. Vance wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Silas. And in that brief second, behind those round glasses, I saw something that would change everything. Vance wasn't just following orders, he was orchestrating them. 3 days later, I woke up shivering in the back seat of my sedan. The windows were completely fogged over, masking the bleak, gray morning. I rubbed my numb hands together and checked my phone. My personal bank accounts, my emergency funds, even my credit cards, all frozen. Silas hadn't just taken the company. He had financially suffocated me before I even reached the estate's front gates. I stepped out into the bitter cold and walked across the street to a rundown diner. Through the greasy glass window, a small television was playing the morning news. There was my face, flashing across the screen next to the Blanc Industries logo. The ticker at the bottom read, "Disgraced heir exiled after mental breakdown at father's funeral." They were destroying my reputation so no one in the corporate world would ever hire me. I had exactly $14 in my pocket. I walked inside, ordered a black coffee, and slid into a torn vinyl booth in the back corner. I pulled out my laptop. The diner's public Wi-Fi was agonizingly slow, but it was all I had. Silas and Vance thought they had covered every track. They confiscated my father's medical records, paid off the nursing staff, and wiped the mansion's main security servers. But they missed one crucial detail. They didn't know about the cheap, $40 nanny cam I had hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of an encyclopedia on my father's bookshelf. I put it there months ago to make sure the night shift nurses were actually checking his vitals. My hands shook as I logged into the cloud backup. I pulled up the footage from the night before my father died. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. The grainy night vision screen showed my father, frail and sleeping peacefully. Then, the heavy oak door slowly creaked open. It was Silas. He walked over to the edge of the bed, holding a folded piece of paper. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out a silver pen. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. This was it. The absolute proof I needed to put him behind bars. But just as Silas reached down to touch my father's hand, the video violently distorted. A thick, jagged band of static ripped across the screen. The audio warped into a deafening screech, and then, nothing. Just a pitch-black screen with a blinking error message. Connection lost. I stared at the black reflection of my own face on the laptop monitor. My blood started to boil. Silas is a dinosaur. The man dictates his text messages to his assistant because he doesn't know how to use a touchscreen. He barely knows how to turn on a smart TV. There is absolutely no way he knew how to deploy a localized, military-grade signal jammer on a hidden Wi-Fi network. Silas wasn't acting alone. There was a ghost in the system, and I needed to find out exactly who it was. It took me 3 hours and my last $14 in gas money to track down Elena. She was Blanc Industries' head of cybersecurity until Silas abruptly fired her the morning of the funeral. I found her in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of the city. When she opened the door, the security chain was still engaged. Her eyes were bloodshot, darting nervously down the hallway. There were half-packed cardboard boxes stacked behind her. "Arthur, you can't be here," she whispered, her hands trembling as she tried to close the door. "If Silas's people see you." I jammed my foot into the doorway. "I don't care about Silas. My father paid for your mother's surgery, Elena. He treated you like family. I just need you to look at one IP address. Please." She stared at my soaked shoes, then up at my exhausted face. A heavy sigh escaped her lips. She slid the chain off the lock. Her living room was a chaotic maze of glowing monitors and humming servers. I handed her my laptop and explained the localized signal jammer. Elena didn't say a word. She just sat down at her custom rig, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. Lines of rapid code reflected in her glasses. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the clicking of the keys and the whirring of cooling fans. "Whoever did this used a military-grade scrambler," she muttered, her eyes tracking the cascading data. "They wiped the MAC addresses and routed the signal through 3 different proxy servers in Eastern Europe. This isn't Silas. Silas can't even connect his phone to Bluetooth." My heart sank. So they got away with it. Elena stopped typing. A slow, dark smirk spread across her face. They were good, but they got arrogant. They forgot to scrub the final ping from the local router. She hit the enter key with a loud clack. A set of coordinates and an IP address flashed onto the main screen in bright red. We finally had our ghost. But as I read the name registered to that private network, the air completely left my lungs. "It's not a residential address," Elena said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "It's a commercial server. Top-tier encryption." She tapped the screen, and a location pin dropped onto a digital map of the city skyline. Downtown, the financial district, 40th floor. I stared at the sleek glass building rendered on the screen. It was the same tower where my father had signed his very first major contract. It was the headquarters of Vance and Associates. "That's Mr. Vance's private legal network," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Elena looked up at me, the blue light from the monitors reflecting in her terrified eyes. "Arthur, your uncle Silas isn't smart enough to hire military contractors to jam a signal. But a corporate lawyer who handles billions in offshore accounts? He has the contacts. He has the clearance." The realization hit me like a freight train. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly unable to support my own weight, until my shoulders hit the cold concrete wall of her apartment. Everything began to make terrifying sense. Silas was just a loud, greedy idiot. A perfect, shiny smokescreen. Vance needed someone from the bloodline to legally inherit the estate so the board of directors wouldn't contest the will. He let Silas take the throne, knowing he could easily manipulate my uncle into signing over the company's core assets to shell corporations. Vance wasn't just facilitating the theft of my legacy. He was the architect. For 30 years, that man sat at our dining table. He brought me birthday gifts. He stood by my father's grave and watched me cry in the rain, holding the very execution order he had forged himself. I closed my eyes. The suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest for days was instantly incinerated, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. My breathing slowed. The trembling in my hands completely stopped. Vance thought he was playing chess with a broken, grieving boy. But he was about to learn that my father taught me how to play the game, too. I opened my eyes and looked at Elena. "Pack your equipment," I said, my voice dead and steady. "We are going to war." I waited in the damp shadows of the underground parking garage beneath the firm. At exactly 6:15 in the morning, Vance's personal secretary, Sarah, stepped out of her faded sedan. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes red from crying. Vance treated her like garbage. He threw hot coffee at her, insulted her intelligence in front of clients, and severely underpaid her for a decade. As she reached for her briefcase, I stepped out of the darkness. She gasped, dropping her car keys on the concrete. I didn't threaten her. I simply held out a single, legally binding contract, already signed in blue ink. 5% of Blanc Industries' voting shares once I regained control. Enough money to disappear tomorrow. I looked into her tired eyes and handed her a matte black microtransmitter no bigger than a coin. She looked at the bug, then at the contract, and slowly closed her fingers around the device. Fast forward to 1:55 in the afternoon. 5 minutes before the emergency board meeting. Silas and Vance were about to sign the authorization to liquidate my family's core assets to untraceable offshore shell companies. From a rented van across the street, Elena and I listened to the dead silence on the audio receiver. Suddenly, the feed crackled to life. Inside the building, Sarah had walked into the empty boardroom carrying a silver tray of ice water. I could hear her ragged breathing through the microphone. She knelt down, pretending to wipe a spill near Vance's custom leather chair. With one swift motion, she pressed the magnetic transmitter to the metal frame under the heavy oak table. She rushed out of the room just as the heavy double doors swung open. I heard the sound of expensive leather shoes hitting the hardwood floor. Silas strolled in, laughing loudly, his heavy gold ring clinking against the wooden table. Vance followed right behind him, setting his vintage brown briefcase down with a soft thud. They sat down, completely unaware that the ghost they thought they had buried was now sitting right in the room with them. I walked past the bewildered receptionist on the 40th floor. I wasn't wearing my soaked charcoal suit anymore. I was wearing my father's bespoke navy pinstripe suit. It fit me perfectly. I didn't knock on the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I kicked them open. The hinges groaned loudly. The entire board of directors turned to look at me in stunned silence. Silas was sitting at the head of the table, a gold pin hovering over the liquidation documents. Vance was standing right beside him, his vintage briefcase open. Silas barked a loud laugh, dropping his pen onto the table. "Arthur, you pathetic lunatic. You broke into a private corporate meeting? Vance, call security and have him thrown down the stairs." Vance reached for the phone on the conference table, but I walked straight toward the main media console, pulling an audio cable from my pocket. "You don't need to call anyone, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice dead calm. "I brought some entertainment for the shareholders." I plugged the cable into my phone. I didn't look at Silas. I kept my eyes locked directly on Vance as I hit play. The boardroom's surround sound speakers hummed to life. The audio was crystal clear. It was Vance's cold, calculated voice, recorded less than 10 minutes ago. "Make sure Silas signs on the dotted line. He is a loud, greedy idiot. Once the assets are transferred to the offshore accounts, I will anonymously leak the forged will to the press. Silas takes the fall for the fraud, he goes to federal prison, and I keep the entire empire." The silence in the room was deafening. Silas slowly turned his head, his face completely drained of color. He looked at Vance, his jaw trembling. Vance's stoic poker face completely shattered. A bead of sweat rolled down from his silver hairline. He lunged across the table for my phone. But before he could take a single step, the glass doors of the boardroom shattered inward. 4 armed federal agents rushed into the room, their tactical boots heavy on the hardwood floor. They bypassed me completely. 2 agents grabbed Silas, pinning him against the mahogany table. The other 2 slammed Vance against the glass wall, violently pulling his arms behind his back. The satisfying click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the room. I stood there, perfectly still, watching the police drag the architect of my misery out the door. Silas was screaming curses at Vance. Vance was dead silent, staring at the floor in absolute defeat. I walked over to the head of the table. I picked up the forged handwritten will, crumpled it in my fist, and tossed it into the trash. Then, I pulled out my father's heavy leather chair and sat down.